She stood in his doorway like a question mark, carved from winter itself, her breath forming desperate clouds in the bitter Oregon air. "Your barn is warmer than the house I grew up in," she would whisper to him later. But in that first moment, Daniel Bourne saw only a woman whose eyes held the particular emptiness that comes from expecting nothing and receiving less. The wind howled through Dust Pine Valley like a banshee, but it was the silence between her words that cut deepest, the kind of quiet that speaks of broken promises and cold suppers eaten alone. She asked for hay to sleep in, nothing more, as if warmth itself was too much to hope for. But Daniel, who had spent 16 winters learning that solitude was safer than disappointment, found himself offering what he'd never given anyone: a place at his table, a quilt that smelled of lavender and safety, and the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, some people were worth the risk. Subscribe to discover how two wounded souls find healing in the most unexpected sanctuary. The barn door creaked open like a confession, and Daniel Bourne looked up from the harness he was mending to see winter itself standing in his doorway. She was small against the vast Oregon sky, her dark coat threadbare at the elbows, her hands clutched around a carpet bag that had seen better decades. Snow clung to her eyelashes like tears that had frozen before they could fall, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular hoarseness that comes from walking too far in cold that cuts straight through to the bone. "I don't mean to trouble you," she said, and Daniel heard in those words the echo of someone who had learned early that her very existence was an inconvenience to be apologized for. He set down his leatherwork and studied her face in the amber light filtering through the barn's high windows. There was something in her eyes, not fear exactly, but the careful wariness of a creature that had been kicked too many times to trust easily. Her cheeks were hollow, with the kind of hunger that goes deeper than missing meals, and when she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, he noticed how she favored her left side, as if carrying an invisible burden that had grown too heavy for her slight frame. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the barn walls and sending eddies of snow swirling around her feet, but she stood perfectly still, waiting for his judgment with the resigned patience of someone accustomed to rejection. "I'm looking for work," she continued, her chin lifting with a pride that seemed to cost her considerable effort. "I can cook, clean, tend animals. I don't eat much, and I don't talk unless spoken to." The words tumbled out in a practiced rush, as if she'd rehearsed this speech in her mind during the long walk that had brought her to his door. Daniel found himself wondering what kind of life had taught her to make herself so small, to offer her labor, while asking for nothing in return except the basic dignity of being allowed to exist. Her fingers worried the handle of her carpet bag, and he noticed how her knuckles were raw from cold, how her wedding ring finger bore the pale mark of a band recently removed. The sheep in the far corner of the barn stirred restlessly, sensing the tension that crackled between the two humans like electricity before a storm. Daniel had always been better with animals than people. They didn't expect conversation, didn't demand explanations for his silences, didn't look at him with the disappointed eyes of those who found his company lacking. But this woman, standing in his doorway like a question he wasn't sure he knew how to answer, seemed to understand something about the value of quiet spaces. She didn't fidget or fill the silence with nervous chatter. She simply waited, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air, her dark eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "The work's honest, but it's hard," Daniel heard himself saying, though he hadn't consciously decided to offer her anything. "Sheep need tending, fences need mending, and winter here can break a person if they're not careful." He watched her face for signs of hesitation, for the moment when the reality of frontier life would send her back to whatever she'd been running from. But instead of fear, he saw something that looked almost like relief wash over her features, as if the promise of hard work was exactly what she'd been hoping to find. Her shoulders straightened slightly, and for the first time since she'd appeared in his doorway, she looked directly into his eyes. "I'm not afraid of hard work," she said, and there was steel beneath the softness of her voice, a strength that had been tested and proven in fires he could only imagine. "I'm afraid of being useless, of taking up space I haven't earned." The honesty in her words hit him like a physical blow, and Daniel realized that this woman, whose name he didn't even know yet, had just offered him something precious and rare, the truth about herself, unvarnished and unafraid. The barn suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, as if her presence had somehow transformed it from a place of solitude into a sanctuary where broken things might finally find the space to heal. Her name was Edith Monroe, and she spoke it like an apology, as if even her identity was something she needed permission to claim. Daniel led her to the small cabin that squatted beside the barn like a faithful dog, its windows glowing amber against the gathering dusk, and watched as she took in the simple furnishings with the careful attention of someone cataloguing potential threats. The main room held a table scarred by years of use, 2 chairs that didn't match, and a stone fireplace that threw dancing shadows across walls, lined with books whose spines had faded to illegible whispers. She set her carpetbag down beside the door, as if she might need to grab it and run at any moment, and when Daniel gestured toward the chair closest to the fire, she perched on its edge like a bird ready to take flight. "You can sleep in the barn tonight," he said, ladling stew from the pot that had been simmering on the stove since morning. "There's clean hay in the loft, and I've got extra blankets." "Yeah." He set the bowl before her and watched as she stared at it with the kind of wonder usually reserved for miracles, her hands hovering over the spoon as if she couldn't quite believe it was meant for her. When she finally took that first bite, her eyes closed briefly, and Daniel saw her throat work as she swallowed not just the food, but what looked like tears she refused to shed. The silence between them stretched comfortable and warm, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant bleating of sheep settling in for the night. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow against the windows with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor, but inside the cabin felt like a world, apart from the harsh realities of winter on the frontier. Edith ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it might be her last, and Daniel found himself studying the way the firelight played across her face, softening the sharp edges of hunger and exhaustion that had marked her features when she first appeared at his door. There was something almost sacred about watching someone truly hungry receive nourishment, something that reminded him of communion services from his childhood, when bread and wine became symbols of grace freely given. "I had a stepfather," she said suddenly, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to catch the words. "He believed children should earn their keep. That comfort was something to be rationed like medicine. Too much would spoil you, make you soft." She set down her spoon and wrapped her hands around the bowl as if drawing warmth from its ceramic walls, her eyes fixed on the amber surface of the stew. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest as he began to understand the careful way she held herself, the apologetic tilt of her shoulders, the way she'd asked for hay to sleep in as if a warm bed was beyond her deserving. Her stepfather had taught her that love was conditional, that safety was temporary, that home was something other people got to have. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney like prayers ascending to heaven, and Daniel found himself remembering his own childhood, not perfect, but filled with the kind of ordinary kindness that he'd taken for granted until this moment. His mother had tucked him in every night, had kissed scraped knees and praised small accomplishments, had made their modest house feel like a fortress against the world's cruelties. Looking at Edith now, he realized what a gift that had been, how the simple act of being wanted had shaped him in ways he'd never fully appreciated. She had grown up in a house where affection was scarce as water in drought, where warmth was something to be earned rather than freely given. "My barn's not much," Daniel said finally, his voice rougher than he'd intended. But it's warm, and the hay's clean, and nobody's going to tell you that you don't deserve to sleep comfortable. He watched as something shifted in her expression, a crack appearing in the careful armor she wore around her heart. For just a moment, he glimpsed the girl she must have been before life taught her to expect so little, before she learned to make herself small enough to fit into spaces where she wasn't wanted. The wind outside seemed to quiet, as if even the storm recognized the significance of this moment, when two lonely souls began to understand that maybe, just maybe, they had found something worth protecting in each other. In the dancing firelight, Edith Munro began to believe that perhaps there were still places in the world where kindness existed without conditions, where a person's worth wasn't measured by what they could provide, but simply by the fact that they were human and deserving of basic dignity. The third morning brought a silence so complete that Edith woke thinking the world had stopped breathing. Snow had fallen through the night, thick and deliberate, erasing the boundaries between earth and sky until everything became one endless expanse of white. She pulled Daniel's quilt closer around her shoulders and watched her breath form small clouds in the barn's dim light. The sheep huddled together in their pen, their wool dusted with frost that had crept through the wooden slats. Outside, she could hear the soft crunch of boots on snow, steady and purposeful. Daniel was already awake, already working, already carrying the weight of another day on shoulders that seemed built for such burdens. When she stepped outside, the cold hit her like a physical blow, sharp and unforgiving. Daniel stood near the well, his back to her, pumping water that came up in reluctant spurts. Ice had formed around the handle, and his bare hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the bitter temperature. He didn't turn when she approached, but she saw the slight tension in his shoulders that told her he was aware of her presence. The silence between them had become a language of its own, full of meanings that neither dared to speak aloud. She picked up the second bucket without being asked and held it steady while he pumped, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked together in the crystalline morning air. The sheep needed hay, and the path to the storage shed had disappeared beneath 2 feet of fresh snow. They worked side by side, Daniel breaking trail with his longer stride, while Edith followed in his footsteps, carrying armloads of golden hay that seemed to glow against the white landscape. With each trip, she found herself studying the way he moved through his world, deliberate, careful, never wasting motion or energy. There was something almost sacred in his relationship with this land, as if every fence post and barn beam held memories that only he could read. She wondered what stories this place might tell, what sorrows it had witnessed, what joys it had sheltered beneath its wide Montana sky. By midday, the work had warmed them both, and they stood in the barn doorway, sharing a thermos of coffee that Daniel had brought from the house. The liquid was bitter and strong, nothing like the weak tea her stepfather had grudgingly provided, and she savored each sip as if it were a luxury beyond measure. Daniel's eyes kept drifting to her hands, wrapped around the metal cup, and she realized he was noticing the scars, thin white lines across her knuckles, a crescent-shaped mark on her palm where a thrown plate had found its target. She started to pull her sleeves down, an automatic gesture born of years of hiding, but something in his expression stopped her. There was no pity there, no questions, just a quiet recognition that spoke of his own hidden wounds. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors, a family traveling the trail whose wagon had broken an axle just beyond Daniel's property line. Edith watched from the barn as Daniel helped the man repair the damage, his movements sure and competent as he worked with tools that seemed like extensions of his own hands. The woman, heavy with child and exhausted from travel, sat on a stump nearby while her 2 small children played in the snow. When the woman began to shiver, Edith found herself walking toward them without conscious decision, carrying the quilt Daniel had given her. She wrapped it around the stranger's shoulders and knelt beside the children, showing them how to make snow angels with their small arms and legs. As evening approached and the travelers continued on their way, Daniel and Edith stood watching the wagon disappear into the gathering dusk. The woman had tried to return the quilt, but Edith had insisted she keep it, knowing that the road ahead would be cold and uncertain. Daniel said nothing about the gesture, but she caught him looking at her with something that might have been approval, or perhaps simply surprise that someone who had so little could give so freely. The silence that settled between them as they walked back to the barn was different now, warmer somehow, as if her small act of kindness had opened a door that neither of them had known existed. The fourth day dawned grey and heavy with the promise of more snow, but inside the barn something had shifted. Edith woke to find Daniel sitting on a hay bale near the door, whittling a piece of wood with slow, careful strokes. He didn't look up when she stirred, but she noticed that he had left a cup of hot coffee within her reach, steam still rising from its surface like a small prayer offered to the morning. The gesture was so simple, so quietly thoughtful, that it made her throat tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. In her stepfather's house, kindness had always come with conditions, with expectations of gratitude that felt more like debts to be repaid. But this felt like grace, pure and uncomplicated. She dressed quickly in the dim light, her fingers fumbling with buttons that seemed reluctant to cooperate in the cold. When she was ready, she approached Daniel slowly, unsure of the protocol for this new dynamic between them. He glanced up from his whittling, and she saw that he was carving a small wooden bird, its wings spread as if caught in the moment of flight. His hands, she noticed, were surprisingly gentle for their size, capable of coaxing beauty from rough wood with the same patience he showed his animals. Without thinking, she asked if she could watch, and he nodded toward another hay bale, an invitation so subtle she almost missed it. They sat in comfortable silence while he worked, the only sounds the soft scrape of his knife and the distant lowing of cattle in the far pasture. The morning chores took on a different rhythm with both of them working together. Daniel showed her how to check the sheep for signs of illness, his hands demonstrating the gentle pressure needed to feel for fever or swelling. When one of the ewes seemed listless, he mixed a tonic from herbs he kept in a wooden box, explaining each ingredient in his quiet voice. Edith found herself hanging on every word, not just because the knowledge was useful, but because it was the most he had spoken since her arrival. There was something almost musical in the way he talked about his animals, a tenderness that suggested depths she was only beginning to glimpse. She wondered if he had always been this solitary, or if life had taught him to guard his words as carefully as he guarded his heart. By afternoon, the threatened snow had begun to fall, not the gentle flakes of the previous day, but hard, driving pellets that stung the skin and made visibility nearly impossible. They worked quickly to secure the animals and bring in extra feed, their movements urgent but coordinated, as if they had been partners for years rather than days. When a sudden gust of wind tore the barn door from Daniel's grip, Edith was there to help him wrestle it closed, their bodies pressed together for a moment in the struggle against the storm. The contact was brief, accidental, but it left her breathless in a way that had nothing to do with the cold wind. She saw something flicker in Daniel's eyes before he stepped away, a recognition that made her pulse quicken and her cheeks burn despite the freezing air. The storm raged through the evening, rattling the barn walls and sending snow through every crack and crevice. They huddled near the small brazier Daniel had brought from the house, sharing a simple meal of bread and preserved meat, while the wind howled like a living thing outside. The warmth of the fire and the shelter of the barn created an intimacy that felt both dangerous and necessary, as if the storm had stripped away the careful distance they had maintained. When Edith began to shiver despite the fire, Daniel wordlessly removed his heavy coat and draped it around her shoulders. The garment smelled of wood smoke and honest work, of a life lived close to the earth and its rhythms. She pulled it closer, feeling safer than she had in years, even as the storm tried to tear the world apart around them. As the night deepened and the fire burned lower, they found themselves talking in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace they had created. Daniel spoke of his farm, of the years he had spent building it from nothing, of the satisfaction he found in work that connected him to something larger than himself. Edith found herself sharing fragments of her own story. Not the worst parts, not yet, but enough to help him understand why she had appeared at his door like a ghost seeking sanctuary. When she mentioned her stepfather's house, how cold it had always been despite the massive fireplace that dominated the main room, Daniel's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding, and Edith realized that perhaps Daniel knew something about cold houses and the people who lived in them, about the difference between shelter and safety, between walls and warmth. The fifth morning brought stillness so profound it seemed to echo in the spaces between heartbeats. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, every surface rounded and softened by snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early light. Edith woke to find Daniel already gone, but the warmth of his coat still wrapped around her shoulders told her that he had covered her while she slept. The gesture was so tender, so protective, that it made her chest ache with a longing she had spent years trying to suppress. She rose slowly, reluctant to disturb the peace of the moment, and made her way to the barn door where she could see Daniel's tracks leading toward the house, dark punctures in the pristine white that marked his passage through the transformed landscape. When she found him, he was standing in his kitchen, staring out the window at the snow-covered fields with an expression she couldn't read. The house was small but well built, with thick walls and windows that let in the morning light without letting in the cold. Everything was clean and orderly, but there was a loneliness to the space that spoke of years lived in solitude, of meals eaten in silence, and evenings spent with only the wind for company. When he heard her footsteps, he turned and offered her coffee from a pot that sat warming on the wood stove. His movements were careful, almost formal, as if having her in his private space required a different kind of protocol than the easy partnership they had developed in the barn and fields. They worked together through the morning, clearing paths and checking on the animals, but there was a new tension between them, an awareness that had been building since that moment when the wind had pressed them together. Edith caught Daniel watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze lingering on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. She found herself studying him in return, noticing the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the careful way he handled even the smallest creatures, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a well-banked fire. The attraction between them was becoming impossible to ignore, but it was complicated by the fragility of her situation, by the knowledge that she was still running from something that might follow her even here. By afternoon, they had settled into a rhythm of work and rest that felt almost domestic, as if they were partners in more than just the daily chores. When Daniel suggested she might be more comfortable sleeping in the house, in the small room that had once belonged to his sister, Edith felt her heart skip with both hope and terror. The barn had been safe because it was temporary, because it didn't require her to believe in permanence or belonging. But a room in his house, that was something different, something that spoke of trust and possibility and all the things she had learned not to want. She studied his face, looking for signs of obligation or pity, but found only a quiet sincerity that made her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't name. The evening brought them together in Daniel's kitchen, sharing a meal he had prepared with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. The food was simple but nourishing. Stew made from vegetables he had grown himself, bread baked that morning, milk still warm from the cow. As they ate, Edith found herself telling him about her stepfather's house, about the way meals had been weapons and kindness had been rationed like precious resources. She spoke of the cold that had nothing to do with temperature, of the way silence could be used as punishment, of the slow erosion of hope that had driven her finally to run. Daniel listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished he reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. The touch was electric, sending warmth racing up her arm and straight to her heart. For a moment, neither of them moved, afraid to break the spell that had settled over them like snow falling on still water. Then Daniel spoke, his voice rough with emotion he had kept carefully controlled. He told her about his own childhood, about a father who had believed that love was weakness and kindness was something to be beaten out of a boy before it could take root. He spoke of the years it had taken him to build this place, this sanctuary, where gentleness was not only allowed but cultivated, where the rhythm of seasons and the needs of animals had taught him that strength and tenderness were not opposites but partners in the dance of survival. When he finally looked up and met her eyes, Edith saw in them a reflection of her own hunger for belonging, her own desperate need to believe that somewhere in this harsh world there might be a place where broken things could heal and wounded hearts could learn to trust again.